Welcome to another episode of Tell Me Another, a podcast dedicated to telling great stories from the past, stories of genius and folly, compassion and cruelty. Instead of sitting around a campfire telling stories of our ancestors, we're coming to you from the History Department of the U.S. Naval Academy, located in Annapolis, Maryland. We're coming with stories to tell, and we hope you will listen. With us in the studio today is Associate Professors Molly Lester and Thomas Burgess, as well as Assistant Professor Nicholas Cross, who will be telling one of the most remarkable stories of the ancient Mediterranean world, the second part of which Dr. Cross is calling, once again, You Only Live Twice, Alcibiades the Athenian 007. So, round two. Take it away, Nick.
Thank you, Thomas. In 405 BCE, the year before the end of the Peloponnesian War, the comic playwright Aristophanes wrote The Frogs, a story about the attempt of the god Dionysus to enliven a dull Athens. He travels to the underworld to bring back one of the big-name tragedians of the past. When Euripides, who had actually died in the previous year, asks the god about how the Athenians feel at this point about Alcibiades, Dionysus responds, "They love him, they hate him, but they cannot do without him." This Athenian fascination with Alcibiades would eventually lead them to overturn the death sentence pronounced against him and welcome him back to the city with an unprecedented reception. But to get to that point, Alcibiades would have to be both ambitious and adventurous. In the summer of 415, the Athenians were in the middle of a campaign against the city of Syracuse in Sicily. The Sicilian expedition had been the brainchild of Alcibiades, who had been prevented from gaining glory in battle because of the ongoing peace of Nicias. Accordingly, he convinced the Athenians to authorize the grand expedition to Sicily. But his political enemies worked behind the scenes to remove him from leadership in the fleet and from Athens altogether. Alcibiades fled to Sparta, but he was both careful and calculating. When he was greeted by Spartans, skeptical as they must have been, he promised to help them against the Athenians, who, he claimed, were prepared to break the peace. Who better to advise them, he asserted, than one who understood the Athenians and knew their current plans? All he asked in return was for immunity and their trust. He could very well have been executed on the spot, but, remarkably, the Spartans accepted him. Alcibiades then gave them 3 specific proposals. First, they could send a force to defend Syracuse from the massive Athenian fleet at Sicily. Second, they could declare the cancellation of the peace of Nicias and the resumption of the Peloponnesian War. And third, they could fortify Decelea, about 12 miles north of Athens, thereby posing a permanent threat to the city. The Spartans had probably already been discussing these plans, but Alcibiades reinforced them and instilled a greater level of enthusiasm for them. He had the ability to win over the Spartans, and, even though they were the most peculiar of all the Greeks, he somehow became one of them. He trained with them. He grew his hair long in the Spartan manner. He took cold baths, and he ate their black broth, a culinary oddity. Alcibiades was adaptable, noted Plutarch, like a chameleon, but even more so. That animal, as it is said, is utterly unable to assume one color, namely white. But Alcibiades could associate with good and bad alike, and found nothing that he could not imitate and practice. This was the key to his survival and success during his exile from Athens. While a chameleon can change its color, a tiger cannot change its stripes. Alcibiades could not deny his playboy tendencies. He was drawn to forbidden fruit like a moth to the flame. After about a year of being a guest in Sparta, he allegedly carried on an affair with Timea, whose name ironically means honor, the wife of King Agis. This transpired while the king was stationed at Decelea, the fort which Alcibiades advised the Spartans to occupy. Timea gave birth to a boy after 10 months of separation from her husband, and even the most simple Spartan could do that math. The boy was not the king's. Timea named the boy Leotychidus, but in private she called him Alcibiades. Whether or not the child was his, Alcibiades read the writing on the wall, and in 412 he prepared to leave Sparta before Agis returned and sought vengeance. Unable to remain in Sparta and condemned to death in Athens, Alcibiades took to the sea. When he was in Athens, he had pushed for the resumption of war by attacking Sicily. While he was in Sparta, the Athenians continued that expedition, but without Alcibiades' leadership, it turned out to be a disaster. By the end of the summer of 413, the Athenians lost 160 ships, along with about 9,000 rowers, 3,000 marines, and thousands of foreign allies. Their tribute-paying allies in the Aegean, anticipating that Athens would soon lose the war, seized the opportunity to revolt and appealed for help from Sparta. Alcibiades, continuing in Spartan service for lack of any viable alternative, sailed to the island of Chios and brought about its defection from Athens. And then he also helped Miletus do the same. This led to the first of 3 treaties between the Spartans and the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, and to the next stage in Alcibiades' circuitous journey back home. He had left Sparta after his affair with the queen because he predicted, correctly, that he would become persona non grata. In fact, it was worse than that. The Spartans sent orders to the admiral of the Peloponnesian fleet to execute Alcibiades. Now, both the Athenians and the Spartans wanted him dead. Having nowhere else in the Greek world to go, he fled to the Persians. Just as he assimilated with ease into Sparta, the chameleon learned how to behave in the Persian court in Sardis and to ingratiate himself into the satrap's good graces. Plutarch takes this occasion to note that if Alcibiades could win over a Persian satrap, he could win over anyone. Even those who feared and hated him felt a rare and winning charm in his society and presence. And thus it was that Tissaphernes, though otherwise the most ardent of the Persians in his hatred of the Greeks, so completely surrendered to the flatteries of Alcibiades as to outdo him in reciprocal flatteries. Soon the chameleon became the satrap's trusted counselor. In all of these machinations, Alcibiades was trying not only to survive. Alcibiades never lost his goal of returning to Athens. With that objective in mind, he advised Tissaphernes to reduce his support for the Spartans and offer some to the Athenians. But how, might Tissaphernes have asked, would that be in his best interest? Alcibiades explained that if he did this, the two sides would wear each other out, and, when the war came to an end, neither side would pose as a rival to him in the Aegean. Of course, this was also personally advantageous for Alcibiades. If he could persuade Tissaphernes of this plan, then he could announce to the Athenians that he had the ear of the Persians and that he could turn the war in their favor. Then they just might allow him to return home. To his relief, Tissaphernes agreed to his suggestion. Now, Alcibiades could make his case to the Athenians.
Nicholas, I'm just struck by how during all this, Alcibiades never loses confidence in himself, and some people would have just gone quietly into permanent exile. But he is still plotting his political comeback, and somehow he's going to manage from all of this to pull rabbits out of a hat and defeat his political rivals somehow back in Athens and come home and triumph. I mean, that's just, it's amazing as chutzpah. So I guess my question really is actually about something else. It's about his advice to the Spartans, which was meant to help them in their war against the Athenians. Did it have any practical impact in some way or another? Did it destroy the Sicilian expedition, or did it have some impact closer to Athens?
Well, Alcibiades believed it did. Alcibiades will go into exile again later on in his career, as we'll see. And there is one theory that Thucydides, the author of all of this, interviewed Alcibiades and got his side of the story. So Thucydides makes us believe that Alcibiades came to Sparta, posed these 3 proposals, and the Spartans had never thought of them before. And it's all because of Alcibiades that the Spartans send a fleet to Sicily, fortify Decalia north of Athens, and break the peace. But probably the Spartans were thinking along these lines already, as I mentioned earlier. Did it work? Well, the Sicilian expedition ended as a disaster for the Athenians, partly because of the Spartan support. They sent a fleet under a man named Gylippus. But also, with Spartan support, Syracuse was able to fight back. But also, probably in the longer term, more importantly, the fort at Decalia. The Spartans do this, and because they do this, a lot of slaves abandon Athens. They go to the Spartans 12 miles north. And the Spartans have a close eye on Athenian movements. Their fort was on a hill, and I've been on this hill. On a clear day, you can see Athens in the distance. So these were moves that were decisive, and not right away, but within a decade, contributed to the downfall of Athens.
Yeah, Nick, as you keep telling this story, I'm a big geography nerd, and it's so interesting how this is not just a story of Sparta and Athens on the Peloponnese. We're going out to Sicily, and now the Persians have entered the picture. You're really showing us that this is a story that plays out on an Eastern Mediterranean canvas. So what I'm interested in is the Persian connection. As you know, even if they had lost to the Greeks a couple decades earlier, the Greeks certainly thought this was a huge deal to them, but the Persians just kept on being the powerful empire that they were. So can you put Alcibiades running to the Persians in the context of Persian-Greek relations at this point? Was there a lot of exchanges, diplomacy between them?
Yeah. Greek and Persian relations go back several decades. Many of the listeners will be familiar with the Greco-Persian Wars. In 490, the Battle of Marathon, 480, Thermopylae and Salamis. And by 479, the Greeks have defeated the Persians had retreated, and this sets up the rise of the Athenian Empire. Between 479 and, the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431, Athens is the dominant political force in the Greek world. So when the Peloponnesian War breaks out, the Spartans recognize that the Athenians have a lot of money to last several years in this war. If the Spartans are going to defeat the Athenians, number one, they're going to need to maybe have some ships because the Athenians are a great naval power.
Good
and
idea.
to do that, and to do that, they'll also need money. They talk about going to Delphi and Olympia and their allies, but ultimately, they want to get funding from Persia. Persia is still smarting from their loss 50, 60 years earlier in the Greco-Persian Wars, and they would like to see Athens humiliated. As we mentioned, Alcibiades helps contribute to the treaties between Sparta and Tissaphernes, in which the Spartans will help the Persians regain some of their control in Asia, and Tissaphernes will fund the Spartans' new navy.
And it's interesting that this is a regional satrap, that he's not dealing with the Persian central court, right? This is kind of a provincial actor that's going on.
Not yet.
Oh,
In
okay.
412, it's with the regional satrap, which will lead to, in the next year, a treaty with the Persian king
Oh,
himself.
so it's coming. Okay, I see.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. In the summer of 412, in response to the revolts in the Aegean, which Alcibiades had encouraged, nearly the entire Athenian fleet was mobilized. Over 100 ships were stationed on Samos, an island off the coast of Tissaphernes territory. Alcibiades watched the buildup of Athenian forces with great interest. Many of the captains on Samos, wealthy men, were anxious to discard the Athenian democracy, which had proven so ineffective, reckless, and wasteful. Alcibiades therefore sent them a letter with an enticing proposal, which Thucydides records. If there were only an oligarchy in the place of the rascally democracy that had banished him, he would be glad to return to his country and to make Tissaphernes their friend. The captains and the leading men in the navy at once embraced the idea of subverting the democracy. It was a bold proposal that the officers accepted. But would the majority of the fleet, the rowers, also agree to surrender the franchise? As it turned out, the answer was yes. Thucydides notes that when the officers announced Alcibiades' plan, the men of the fleet were irritated at first, but they finally acquiesced when they heard about the Persian subsidies. They endorsed a moderate form of oligarchy, one that would provide them with pay and empower them to prosecute the war to its conclusion. Alcibiades was elated at the opportunity to return to military service and to return home. But before Alcibiades could start packing his bags, one of the captains, Pisander, hijacked the plan. He convinced many of the officers to adopt a very exclusive oligarchy and to ignore Alcibiades. Pisander returned to Athens and convinced the assembly to replace the democracy with a board of only 400 members. The new government proceeded to negotiate with the Spartans. Deceived, the men of the fleet responded by seceding from the new regime. They dismissed from positions of leadership all who had been partisans of Pisander and elected new officers who were at odds with the 400 and were determined to continue the Peloponnesian War. They reinforced this separation with the city of Athens by recalling Alcibiades as their admiral. He arrived at Samos at the same time as envoys from the 400 did. They announced to the fleet the oligarchy was not established for the hurt of the city or the citizens, but for the salvation of the country at large, and that there were 5,000 not 400 only. This was misinformation, designed to deceive the Athenians on Samos into supporting the 400. But the men of the fleet refused to listen. They called for the execution of those who sabotaged Alcibiades' original plan, and for them to attack Piraeus, the port of Athens. Immediately, Alcibiades exercised his new authority as an admiral. However much he hated Pisander and the 400, he refused to allow the men to become distracted from the real war against the Peloponnesians. He calmed their anger, which Thucydides says, with some hyperbole, was the first time he did the state a service, and one of the most outstanding kind. It was not his first service to the state, but it was far from his last. In the next 4 years, Alcibiades and his associates would go undefeated in the war and would contribute to the reclamation of Athenian naval superiority. After pacifying the men of the fleet and redirecting their attention to the Peloponnesian enemy, Alcibiades returned to Tissaphernes in an attempt to follow through on the promises he had made to the fleet. He failed to accomplish anything with the satrap, a major setback for his plan to unite the Athenians and the Persians. But he was not one to let something like this deter him. Later, he spun this as a success, claiming that he convinced Tissaphernes not to release the 147 Phoenician ships that he had previously promised to the Spartans. Still, incapable of procuring material support, Alcibiades would have to prove himself in battle. He returned to the fleet that had since moved northwards to the Dardanelles Strait. As it happened, early in the morning before he arrived, a sea battle had broken out at Abydos, at the narrowest point of the Dardanelles. All day, 76 Athenian ships fought 86 Peloponnesian ships, with no side emerging victorious. As evening fell, by chance, says Plutarch, 18 ships appeared in the distance. Neither side recognized who the new arrivals were until Alcibiades raised a purple banner, thereby announcing his identity. The Athenians were emboldened by his serendipitous appearance, but the Peloponnesians, crestfallen, retreated. Alcibiades was ambitious and an adventurer who outshone all others, even when he was not actually in the battle. Time and again he found himself in tight situations and yet found a way to escape. After the victory at Abydos, he traveled yet again to Tissaphernes. He persisted in believing his own propaganda, that he could convince the Persians to support the Athenians. Instead of a welcome reception, however, Tissaphernes imprisoned Alcibiades. But he possessed the versatility of a chameleon, and after a month, he escaped from prison. He rejoined the Athenian fleet in early 410, just in time for the naval battle at Cyzicus on the southern shore of the Black Sea. Alcibiades' part in the battle was largely that of a decoy that drew the Peloponnesians away from the harbor. He then made a beeline for the shore and fought on land. Meanwhile, the other Athenian commanders came in and attacked the scattered enemy. The victory was won by those other commanders, but Alcibiades was swashbuckling and daring. As a result of the victory, the Athenians regained control of the seas and of their allies in the region, and they became financially solvent. Alcibiades went from Cyzicus to Chrysipolis on the eastern shore of the Bosporus, and established a customs house that collected a 10% tax on all commercial traffic through the strait. In the coming 2 years, he and his associates restored their control of Chalcedon and Byzantium, among other small city-states in the region, thereby ensuring a steady flow of money into the Athenian treasury. It also coincided with the reinstitution of democracy in Athens. By 407, it had been nearly 8 years since he had left Athens for the Sicilian expedition, and a little over 3 years since the fleet had recalled him. But only now, after a string of successes, did he finally feel safe enough to return to the city of Athens. Upon hearing that he was on his way home, a large crowd of Athenians walked the 6 miles from Athens to Piraeus to welcome him. From a distance, however, Alcibiades could not judge their intentions. As his ship approached the harbor, he wondered if they had come to arrest him. He felt such apprehension that at first he refused to leave the ship. Then he saw his cousin and friends on shore. When he recognized that it was a merry instead of a menacing crowd, he disembarked. Plutarch says that the people ran in throngs to Alcibiades with shouts of welcome, escorting him on his way and putting wreaths on his head as they could get to him, while those who could not come to him for the throng gazed at him from afar, the elderly men pointing him out to the young. Cornelius Nepos adds that he received these tokens of his fellow citizens' devotion with tears in his eyes as he recalled their cruelty in the past. Honored as no Athenian had ever been before him, Alcibiades returned home.
What a triumphant return for Alcibiades. What an amazing story. This is a story that stuck with me for years. I took Greek history as an undergraduate, and this is one of the most amazing parts of the whole semester for me, so I'm glad you're telling the story so well. I guess for people who are less familiar with Greek history, it may come as a huge surprise that Athens, the birthplace of democracy, would, in a time of war, that the crisis of war, suspend democracy and abandon one of the core elements of Athenian identity. So I guess, what does that say? Does that say that ultimately they cared more about their own individual survival as a city-state, as long as the rowers got paid? Is this a fair characterization? What would you say, Nick?
I'd say there's 2 ways of looking at this. One of them would be that of the ancient authors who are largely critical of democracy. Thucydides, as I mentioned earlier, is in exile. He's disappointed with the way the Peloponnesian War has turned out after his hero Pericles has died. And Thucydides presents a lot of this as the democracy gone wild. It's voting to go on this wild expedition against Sicily. It's voting itself out of existence in 411. I think that's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is the war has gone bad for the Athenians after the Sicilian expedition. Allies are defecting. Sparta is gaining new naval power in the Aegean. And the fleet, the Athenian fleet that's stationed at Samos, is led by an admiral named Thrasybulus. And Thrasybulus seems to be a clear-headed, sober statesman. I think he sized things up and convinced the rowers that this would not be a permanent thing. This would be something that is a war measure. We could use some better leadership. We need to use more funding from the Persians. So in that case, it is a rather practical decision, but the fleet didn't foresee the exclusive oligarchic hijacking of this plan. So I think these are 2 different ways to see it. It is the irrationality of the Athenian democracy. But at the other hand, this could have worked if perhaps Pisander hadn't hijacked the plan.
That's really fascinating. Thank you.
When Alcibiades arrived in the city, he addressed the council and the assembly. He complained of his past treatment. He insisted that now that he had returned, the curses placed on him must be formally lifted, and the documents related to his exile destroyed. No one refused him this. They even awarded him a crown of gold and elected him supreme commander on land and sea, the first time an Athenian was ever given such power. They also permitted him to select the other generals to serve with him in the upcoming year. He now possessed unprecedented political and military power, and he topped it off by resurrecting the religious pilgrimage to Eleusis. It had been discontinued ever since the Spartans had occupied Decelea, which Alcibiades had advised when he lived in Sparta. Because the 11-mile sacred way passed under the observing eyes of the Spartan fort. By leading this procession to Eleusis, therefore, he humiliated Agis, his personal rival, who did nothing to stop the worshippers. Alcibiades had risen to the pinnacle of power in the Athenian democracy, but the Athenians would be disappointed in their expectations. His continuous successes, comments Plutarch, gave him such repute for unbounded daring and sagacity that when he failed in anything, men suspected his inclination. They would not believe in his inability. In the late summer of 407, Alcibiades set sail from Piraeus with 100 ships, which required thousands of rowers. It was difficult for Alcibiades to provide pay for all the men in his fleet. He therefore left the ships at Notium, while he went away on a money collection mission. When he left, he placed his friend Antiochus in charge of the fleet, but instructed him not to initiate an attack against the enemy across the way at Ephesus. But Antiochus disobeyed those orders. Perhaps seeking to repeat Alcibiades' daring move at Cyzicus, he darted with only a few ships toward Ephesus to incite the Spartans, who complied and sailed out for battle. Antiochus was no Alcibiades. He was killed in the battle, while the Spartans captured around 15 Athenian ships. Alcibiades returned immediately and tried to repair the damage, but the enemy, satisfied with the victory, refused to face him. The supreme commander was left powerless. Notium was a humiliation for Alcibiades. It broke a string of successes going back 5 years. He lost his aura of invincibility. Complaints about his leadership began to circulate. Some called him a phony, a braggart. Others criticized his decision to leave the main fleet in the hands of a subordinate who was not an officer. Soon there was a groundswell of protest. The Athenians once loved him, now they hated him and no longer wanted him around. Finally, they turned completely against him and chose other admirals to replace him. Alcibiades read the situation and chose to go into voluntary exile before the Athenians imposed on him a penalty or revived calls for his execution. He went to Thrace, where he had personal connections and a grand residence. He never saw Athens again. We do not hear about him again until 405, when the Athenian fleet of 180 ships was harbored at Aegospotami in the Dardanelles, across from Lampsacus, where there was a similar number of Peloponnesian ships. From his home, Alcibiades could see that the Athenians were in an ominous position without realizing it. He came down to the Athenian admirals and urged them to move the fleet 12 miles to the south, to Cestus, where they had better access to supplies. The admirals ignored him, reasoning that if they listened to him and lost, they would be punished at home. But if they listened to him and won, he would receive the credit. So they gave no heed to his warnings. In the ensuing confrontation, the Athenians were ruined. The enemy captured most of their ships and executed over 3,000 Athenians. The Peloponnesian War was effectively over. Alcibiades' career was tied to his achievements, real or perceived, in the war. But now, without the war, there was no more scheming and planning left for him. What did not change, however, was his personal danger. The Spartans never forgave him for his betrayals. Now that their conflict with Athens was over, they turned their attention to capturing the rogue. In a move that has become all too familiar to us in this story, Alcibiades petitioned the Persians for refuge. He approached Pharnabazus, another satrap who ruled near Alcibiades' residence in Thrace. While he stayed with Pharnabazus, the satrap received a request from the Spartans to do away with Alcibiades. There are several stories about who did the deed, but in the end, a group of assassins surrounded Alcibiades' living quarters and set it on fire. When he escaped out his door, the assassins shot him with javelins and arrows. Thus ended the storied life of Alcibiades. Throughout his life, Alcibiades confounded the Athenians. His joie de vivre disappointed his teacher Socrates. His exploitation of democratic processes frustrated his political rivals. He endured ostracism and trials. He was condemned to death by the Athenians and the Spartans, and went into exile on more than one occasion. But Alcibiades possessed qualities that fascinated all with whom he had come into contact. He was charismatic, articulate, and optimistic. He backed this up with incredible military, political, and diplomatic success. Some ascribed to him when he had nothing to do with them. Aristophanes hit it on the head when he said, "They love him, they hate him, but they cannot do without him."
What an end to this story. Some might say Alcibiades had it coming, but some might have wanted another episode in this career. So, as we come to the end of the story, I want to go back to a description of Alcibiades that Plutarch said, that he was like a chameleon, that Alcibiades could associate with good and bad alike, and found nothing that he could not imitate and practice. And it really, that quote and the story that you've just told us really makes me think about human agency in history. So Alcibiades is adapting to his circumstances, but how much did his circumstances adapt him and constrain him? So in your opinion, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. You read the ancient sources, and it looks like Alcibiades is doing all this, that events are being driven by his actions, his decisions. But we can kind of see behind some of these stories that Alcibiades is often receiving credit even when he's not involved in a battle. And there have been a few modern scholars who have said Alcibiades is not as great as he makes himself out to be, as his followers made him out to be, as the Athenians thought he was when they welcomed him back home. And in fact, Cornelius Nepos comments about one of the battles in the North Aegean, in which there's another admiral named Thrasybulus. And Cornelius Nepos comments that when they won a battle due to Thrasybulus's leadership, the credit was still given to Alcibiades. I think that can be applied to many events in his life. Plutarch, he's fascinated with individuals. He's also fascinated in moral lessons. I think we need to remember he's not a historian.
Right, he's a biographer.
Right.
He said, doesn't he say in the life of Alexander, oh, history is just like, things that happened. I'm interested in character, so I'm going to do biography.
Right. So sometimes you can kind of read between the lines in Plutarch's stories and question whether Alcibiades was indeed as magnificent and sagacious as Plutarch writes him out to be. Alternatively, maybe he wasn't as bad as Plutarch and others make him out to be.
And that's kind of the joy, at least I find, of doing history, right? Is you kind of get to look at these great stories, but you also get to unravel them in the sense of who are the other actors, who's kind of behind the scenes, even if they're kind of a faceless mess, like the rowers or something like that, as well as thinking about, where is the truth in all of this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Somewhere in between.
Yeah. I don't remember if I mentioned it earlier about there's an idea that Thucydides writes the second half of the war based on interviews with Alcibiades, and this explains why Alcibiades is so prominent in books 5, 6, 7, and 8 of Thucydides' history. Thucydides is a great historian. He's got a critical mind, but perhaps he was also fascinated with Alcibiades and was taken in by some of Alcibiades' his storyline.
Well, aren't we all just suckers for a good story?
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Tell Me Another. From all of us in the studio, we wish you a wonderful day.